So I don't really know much about React, and I don't know anything about React Suspense. But based on some conversations that I've heard about Suspense, it seems that there's this idea that delaying the rendering of loading indicators can, in the context of low latency, actually decrease the amount of perceived latency on behalf of the user. So I wanted to see if I could implement that kind of idea in Angular using simple CSS animations. So to get a sense of whether or not there's a difference in perceived latency, I have a content area here that I can toggle on and off, and the rendering of the loading indicator will be driven by these different links, with the numbers here being the milliseconds of latency. So for example, if I use 0 milliseconds, you can see that the loading indicator shows right away. And if I use something like 1,000 milliseconds or a second, what you'll see is that the loading indicator sometimes doesn't show depending on the latency in which this content is received and the content area is showed. So again, 0 shows it right away. 300 milliseconds is obviously a slight delay. So in that case, there was no loading indicator because we can see that the fetch latency was actually less than 300 milliseconds. So let's try it again. And there we saw it for a moment because you can see we have a 700 millisecond latency, so it's about halfway through. Right, so you can see sometimes 300 milliseconds shows the loading indicator, and sometimes it doesn't. 500 milliseconds is a little bit more impactful because it gives the simulated latency a lot more time to run. Let's see if we can get a... See, that's pretty close. There we go. So we saw it there for a moment. So let's take a look at how this works under the hood. I wanted to try to keep the calling context as simple as possible. So here you can see is our list of toggles, and this is the app component. I didn't want the app component to actually manage the delay itself. The app loader is the loading indicator, and you can see I'm just using a simple ngIf directive to hide and show the indicator, and it's a simple Boolean. And what we can see down here is when we go to toggle, this is loading indicator is just either false or true. There's no more complex logic in the app component. The app component only either shows or hides the loading indicator. All of the concept of the delay is pushed into the loading indicator itself. The only thing that we're doing is we're taking that delay in milliseconds, right? We're putting that in the delay property, and then we're piping that into the loading indicator as an input binding. So we're telling the app loader, the loading indicator, that we want a delay, but we don't care about how it's implemented, and we certainly don't use that to affect whether or not our loading component is on the page. So let's take a look at the loader to see how this works. The input binding for the delay here, you can see, is being parlayed into a style attribute on the host component here, and particularly it's being piped into the animation delay using milliseconds. And that's the only logic here in the loading component for this demo. And if we jump over into the less, we can see how this is being used. So we are applying an animation to the host. These keyframes over here only have a from and a to, or a 0% and 100%. And you can see that we're using opacity of 0 to hide the loading indicator, and then an opacity of 1 to show the loading indicator after the animation has taken place. Now that input binding, which is being used here to set up the animation delay, is being used here to determine how long this 0% opacity is being applied to the loading indicator. So if we have a delay of 300 milliseconds, because of this fill mode of both, that means that this opacity of 0 will be applied to the loading component for 300 milliseconds, and then for some portion of the 250 millisecond animation duration. So that's really all there is to it. Essentially, the loading component is on the page the entire time that the loading is happening, but it is not visible to the user because of this animation delay with the initial value of a 0 opacity. So we're pushing the implementation details into the loading component. The loading component could, at some point in the future, change this from a CSS-based delay to some other type of delay. But the idea here is that we're delaying the rendering in order to help decrease the perceived latency on behalf of the user. And I don't know how I feel about it. I do feel like maybe seeing the loading indicator all the time has a negative effect. Somehow that 300 milliseconds sometimes feels like might be a little bit better. I don't know. I don't really feel strongly. I'd have to see it in the context of a more robust Angular application before I would know whether or not there's actually an effective difference here. But it's definitely an intriguing idea, and it's nice to see that it can be implemented actually quite easily with simple CSS animations. And because the logic for this is encapsulated within the loading component, it means that we can change this implementation after the application has been built, as long as we're using the loading component consistently across the application, or some form of it, or some sort of a subclassing of it. So that's just a nice thing about how this is all put together.